Welcome to This Explainer. When most of us think of engineering, our minds immediately jump to math, right? Physics, complex blueprints, maybe folks in hard hats. But today, we're diving into something a bit different. We're going to look at why an engineer's job involves so much more than just crunching those numbers. It actually carries strict, absolute legal accountability. So let's kick things off by asking a pretty heavy question. What actually happens when the people who build our world completely ignore the rules? I mean, think about it for a second. Think about the infrastructure you interact with every single day. The bridges you drive over, the office buildings you work in, the systems that deliver your drinking water. These aren't just cool technical marvels. They are structures with literal life or death stakes attached to every single bolt. To really set the stage here, listen to this powerful quote from Professor M.M.A. Hashem. He was giving a lecture at the Kolna University of Engineering and Technology, and he said this: "An engineer who ignores the law risks not only a project, but public trust and human lives." Wow. That completely shifts the perspective, doesn't it? Engineering isn't just this isolated technical profession. It's a profoundly social one, and the consequences of getting it wrong are massive. All right, here's our quick roadmap for today's explainer. We'll start with the weight of engineering, move on to professional rules and acts, then compare civil versus criminal liability, look at upholding the Constitution, and finally, we'll examine a really tragic real-world case study, Rana Plaza. Let's get right into it. Section 1. The weight of engineering. The foundational premise we need to understand is that engineering decisions, they definitely do not happen in a vacuum. Every choice an engineer makes directly impacts public safety, the broader economy, and the environment. And because the stakes are just so incredibly high, an engineer standing up in court and saying, "Hey, I didn't know the law," is literally never a valid defense. The law clearly defines an engineer's rights, their duties, and exactly how they're going to be held accountable if things go south. So navigating all these heavy responsibilities means navigating this tricky intersection of right, wrong, duty, and the greater good. It really takes a tight combination of strict legal compliance on one hand and strong ethical judgment on the other. You honestly can't have one without the other if you want to successfully and safely practice engineering. Moving right along to Section 2, Professional Rules and Acts. Okay, so this is the very first layer of regulation engineers are going to run into in the real world. Professional acts basically exist for two main reasons: to regulate the profession itself and to protect the public interest. So how do they actually pull that off? Well, mostly through mandatory registration and licensing. You can't just wake up one day, print a business card, and call yourself an engineer. You have to prove your competence. These acts enforce strict codes of professional conduct and spell out super clear disciplinary actions for anyone who steps out of line. Which leads us straight to a golden rule in this field: practice only within your area of competence. It sounds obvious, right? If you're a software engineer, you really shouldn't be signing off on a massive suspension bridge. Under these professional acts, engineers must strictly avoid false certification, they absolutely have to avoid conflicts of interest, and they must never, ever misrepresent their qualifications. It all boils down to fundamental integrity. Section 3. Civil versus criminal liability. All right, we are now conceptually stepping into the courtroom to look at the stark difference between a mistake that costs money and a mistake that costs your freedom. On the civil side, we're talking about private disputes. Think things like a breach of contract or property damage from a wonky design. The penalty here? It's almost always compensation, basically paying out of pocket for the screw-up. But on the criminal side, it's a totally different ballgame. These are considered offenses against society itself. If an engineer commits fatal negligence, the penalty shifts from simply writing a check to facing massive fines or, even imprisonment. Just to really solidify this crucial distinction in our minds, civil law is basically about handshakes and contracts that represent private agreements. Criminal law, on the other hand, is about handcuffs and jail cells representing a literal loss of liberty. They are two totally distinct worlds of legal liability. So, how exactly does an engineer wind up in civil trouble anyway? Well, it usually comes down to negligence, and that follows three very clear legal steps. Step 1. A duty of care actually exists between the engineer and the client, or the public. Step 2. That specific duty is breached, maybe through terrible supervision or by letting a contractor use substandard materials. And finally, Step 3. Damage occurs directly because of that breach. When all three of those things line up, boom, the engineer is civilly liable for the resulting compensation and, of course, the massive hit to their reputation. But things take a much darker turn when we look at criminal law.
When an engineer's actions harm society at large, the gavel comes down so much harder. We're talking about gross negligence that actively causes death or severe injury. We're talking about corruption, bribery, or explicitly ignoring red flag safety warnings. Falsifying test reports just to save a few bucks? Yeah, that crosses the line straight into criminal territory, where handcuffs become a very, very real possibility.
Section 4. Upholding the Constitution. Now we're looking at the absolute highest level of legal framework governing our society. Using the Constitution of Bangladesh as our example here, a constitution guarantees citizens their fundamental rights to life, to safety, and to environmental protection. But you might be wondering, what does a national constitution have to do with an engineer sketching out a local drainage system? Well, it's actually a pretty simple equation. Safe roads, structurally sound buildings, clean water, and reliable power literally equal the right to life. An engineer's daily work directly upholds these constitutional values. Think about it. When you build safe infrastructure, you are essentially acting as a guardian of the public interest. You're ensuring that development is sustainable and that the rule of law is physically maintained in the built environment all around us. Section 5. Case Study, Rana Plaza. We need to slow down for a second and look at a devastating real-world tragedy that horribly illustrates everything we've just discussed about negligence, duty, and the law. 1,134. That is the staggering number of lives lost on April 24, 2013, when the Rana Plaza building collapsed in Savar, Bangladesh. Nearly 2,500 more people were injured. Why did this happen? Because the building's owner, the contractors, and the factory managers actively ignored highly visible structural cracks and just continued operations anyway. It remains one of the absolute darkest days in modern industrial history. As you'd expect, the legal fallout was incredibly severe, and it heavily involved the engineering professionals. The owner was charged with murder and criminal negligence. But crucially, several engineers and structural professionals were also criminally charged. They were prosecuted for falsifying safety reports and for officially certifying a wildly unsafe building without doing their required due diligence. They put their professional signature on a structurally doomed building. Which brings us to the ultimate heartbreaking lesson from this tragedy: strict enforcement of building codes protects public safety. Professional certification isn't just some annoying paperwork you rush through on a Friday afternoon. It is quite literally a matter of life and death. An engineer can absolutely be held criminally liable when their negligence contributes to a catastrophic failure like Rana Plaza. Rigorous, uncompromising enforcement is paramount. All right, let's quickly recap what we've covered today with our key takeaways. First up, legal compliance is just as critical as technical competence. You can be an absolute genius at math, but if you ignore the law, you completely fail as an engineer. Second, negligence carries incredibly severe civil and criminal consequences. It's not just about losing your job, it's about massive financial compensation and potential imprisonment. And finally, engineers are the silent guardians of our constitutional values, quite literally protecting our fundamental right to a safe life. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one final thought. The next time you walk into a towering office building or drive across a massive bridge, ask yourself, whose ethical judgment is actually holding this up? Who signed off on the steel, the concrete, the foundation beneath your feet? It's an incredibly heavy responsibility, but it's exactly what makes the engineering profession so absolutely vital to everything we do. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep asking questions about the built world around you.